is the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 46, Death, Only the Beginning.
Welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast. This is your host, Jason.
And I'm Mark.
And you just heard Infernal Death from Death. And tonight, or today, or whenever you're listening to our podcast, we're going to be doing Death, Only the Beginning.
Yes.
And tell us about our brainstorming process about how to approach a band like Death, I guess.
Death's almost a band that needs to have... all their albums are valid for sure, but especially the early on stuff, how many different bands they influenced and how... they were kind of an anomaly, really, in the scene for people that, for a guy that could actually play guitar pretty well even back then. Yeah. And it was like a constant, I don't think he ever really found like the ultimate Death lineup.
No, not at all. Chuck Schuldiner kind of is the main centerpiece, not only of Death, but like the whole sort of Florida scene revolved around him. And really, in a way, not just the Florida scene, because, he was intimately connected to, as we'll talk about later, like Autopsy in weird ways, and even the Genocide Repulsion, lineup in Michigan that we've done a show on.
Was it
Slaughter up in Toronto? So even DRI. When we talk about some of the demo era of Death here in a few minutes, but he's just such an integral figure, and certainly I don't know if people really gained an appreciate. He was definitely appreciated when he was alive, but I think once his tragic kind of early death left us without the band and without his vision, I think like people start to kind of like come out of the woodwork a little bit and go, oh my god, like this guy, look at what he did from album to album, in terms of advancing the genre forward in so many different ways, adding technicality and musicianship and
still keeping, even, on the last record, I think that was almost the perfect melding of that brutality, yet, being incredibly technical.
Melody and technical and songwriting and deep, and when I say songwriting, moving the band away from the lyrics you're going to hear on the show that we're doing tonight, which is, the gore, the satanic imagery, all the early death metal cliches, essentially. But the thing is when we're talking about this stuff, especially in the first of kind of 3 episodes that we'll eventually do, not in order or anything, but this wasn't cliche then. You know, there weren't a lot of bands that were doing gore lyrics, and you know, you had Slayer, you had Possessed, you had a couple like European bands that were doing darker things like Bathory and Celtic Frost and King Diamond, but
yeah, really,
it wasn't
Creator and Destruction a little bit, but they weren't. Yeah. It wasn't as blatant gore either.
Yeah, you know, and I mean, most of the thrash bands weren't doing like, I mean, they would mention, you know, like macabre subject matter at times, but they weren't obsessive about it. This was, you know, one of the first bands to sort of enter into the horror movie lyrics and the gore movie lyrics and all the sort of things that would become very, like we said before, cliche in the whole death metal scene, I think.
Yeah, especially with like New York death metal, you know, Suffocation, Cannibal Corpse, and, you know, Mortician, all that kind of stuff. So
sure. You know, so we decided to take the approach of, you know, how to divide this up. You know, we originally conceived it as maybe doing a 2-parter, like kind of the early years and then the later years. But there's so much to talk about that we wanted to kind of keep it. We wouldn't want to action pack a whole bunch of songs and get like into an hour and 5 minutes of music, because then it limits us in terms of our ability to sort of talk about the band and the level that we probably need to.
Yeah, I would think most listeners might have at least one death record in their collection. So, and a lot of this stuff is pretty, I mean, it's been covered countless times, and it's a pretty good staple in most, you know, extreme metal people's collections, I would think.
Yeah, and doing just like a 2-parter would make it hard for us to I think, it would be hard for me, being such a huge Death fan. I know you feel the same way, like to axe some of those, I guess, essential songs, and you know, why limit like an album down to like 2 songs or something when there's like so much essential songwriting things that he was doing. And you know, almost every song, even like the stuff from Scream Bloody Gore, which is so primitive and really kind of repetitious at times, has like its moments. It's different. You can, you know, it's individual kind of like nuggets of wisdom or like forward-looking musicianship.
Well, you've got to think of it in context too. When the thing came out, you didn't hear anything like that before. I mean, it's just a lot of the stuff, you've got to take the historical and cultural context of all of it to I think fully appreciate it. If you just throw on Scream Bloody Gore to somebody and don't tell them anything about it, they're just like, you know, somebody record this in their basement. You know, what is this crap? So
yeah. And so, you know, that's how we kind of, you know, decided to approach a show like this. And I mean, this is for me a pretty intimate band. I don't know for you where you rank these guys in terms of your favorite American kind of death metal. I mean, I know they're probably right up there.
As far as American death metal, they're pretty high.
Yeah.
And I kind of fell off.
Not great. You know?
Yeah, after Individual Thought Patterns, I kind of dropped off for a while, and I didn't actually listen to the other albums when they came out. So,
and Mark and I don't know how much we'll be able to get into it in this episode, but you know, Mark and I have way different entryways into this band, and that's the coolest part about a band like Death, as opposed to say Obituary or even Morbid Angel to some extent, who, while Morbid Angel always continued to progress, they always had like sort of the main template of what Morbid Angel's song would sort of look like. Whereas I could play you like the song we just heard, Infernal Death, which, you know, opens up with this, you know, just brutal scream and of die, you know, and then just plotting like Chris Reifert drumming and stuff, and kind of really repetitious, really barbaric kind of death metal, and you know, throw that against something from Individual Thought Patterns, and you might not even know it's the same band. And that's what's so cool about a band like Death is wherever you entered into the band is going to sort of shape, I think, your consciousness about not only what American death metal is, but what it isn't, and I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain, but I think for those of you out there who are listening who know Death pretty intimately, I think you're probably nodding your heads right now going, oh yeah, that makes sense, you know. If somebody like bought Symbolic first and then all of a sudden bought Scream Bloody Gore, that's a really strange leap to make, and that might be difficult for like a fan to go that far back.
When you're talking how, you know, Scream Bloody Gore is almost like Scum to how it was tape traded so heavily before the record came out. It had this legendary status before the thing was even pressed on vinyl.
Yeah, I mean, this is a record that was 4 years in the making, you know, and this is back in the legendary days of, you know, the tape trading market when, you know, demos were just recorded, And then, of course, you made 10 copies for your buddies, and then they made 10 dubs from that. And the sound quality of so many of these songs was just like destroyed throughout the years.
Yeah.
That I think people didn't really know what to expect when an album like Scream Bloody Gore came out.
For sure.
But in terms of, I guess, a little bit of the early backstory for these guys, they started off as Mantis,
83, 84.
Yeah, and I think wasn't that with Cam Lee?
Cam Lee and Rick Ross, I believe.
Ross, yeah, and Cam Lee was the drummer, I do believe, and then Cam Lee will, of course, go on and form Massacre. Rick Ross will be part of he'll be part of Massacre as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so both those guys will go on, but Cam Lee won't stick around for as long, whereas Roz sort of like reconnects later in life with Chuck and stuff. But whenever we talk about Death or any of these lineup changes, just Chuck's the constant. So
he's the only constant.
Yeah, so we won't like reiterate and mention him over and over again. You just got to assume like Chuck's always there. Chuck's the one doing the vocals. He's obviously playing all the guitar parts, especially in that song. He's actually playing the bass on Scream Bloody Gore, the very first stuff. The only thing Chuck really never did was of course the drumming, but they started off as Mantis like 83 and then put out like the Death by Metal demo in 84. They were from Florida, and nobody liked what they were doing. I mean, these guys were like despised. I think. Well,
he was an anomaly. I think that was half the problem, was finding once you could actually find a drummer that would want to play this stuff. It's like, well, this guy, I guess he's good enough to do what we needed. And I think it was almost a good thing that he was almost held back a little bit by a lot of those early musicians that he collaborated with. I think it kind of made him, explore a little bit more like what he could do with the brutality side.
Yeah.
And still get the technicality.
And get his chops kind of up before he tried to do, like, Chuck's always been an idea guy and a really, I think, an ideological personality, which I think brings him into conflict with a lot of his people, because I think his vision of like what he wants is so unwavering that I think that
he's like an auteur director or something.
Yeah, I mean, he just, he's a bastard in a way, but yet his brilliance will always shine through in the end product. It's like the story of like Kubrick and like The Shining, trying to get that performance from what's her face, Shelley
Duvall.
Yeah, but he would chase her around with like knives and shit and yell at her and just get crazy on her all the time, and to get that performance out of her, and of course she's terrorized in that movie. And I think Chuck was that sort of way. Maybe I think he came across as bullyish, and I think in the same way that for those of you obviously familiar, I'm sure, with Metallica and Megadeth, you go back and see that like Some Kind of Monster documentary, and Mustang's kind of like talking to the guys about, like, why didn't anybody like talk to me? And I think when these metal guys, especially like macho, it's such a macho genre on some level, nobody like talks about their problems or like their issues. I think they just let's fire the guy, let's just get rid of the guy. We can't sit down and communicate. And so I think that's why the lineup shifted so much in those early years, because I think Chuck was just such a strong personality, and nobody else could deal with that most of the time.
It takes a certain kind of individual to be able to collaborate on that level without creative input, for the most part. I think I know on Spiritual Healing he's got a couple, James Murphy
did a couple co-songwriting credits.
And even Terry, what the hell's his last name?
Butler.
Terry Butler is actually credited as well.
Oh, is he? Okay.
So I don't know what the
here's a riff here, here's a riff there, kind of thing. But Chuck's writing all the solos, Chuck's writing the lyrics. I mean,
he's still definitely like steering the ship in the right direction. These guys are just kind of adding their flourishes, but
and I don't know how collaborative he'll get. We'll obviously talk about this in later episodes. I'd have to look at like Individual Thought Patterns and Symbolic to see if anybody wrote songs on those records, and stuff. But one of the constants of Death, if you will, is that the lineup will never be the same on any record that they've ever put out. I think
the longest.
That's the constant.
Between on Leprosy and Spiritual Healing, you got Terry Butler and Bill Andrews that.
But then you've added
carried
Murphy
over. But then you got Murphy.
There's always never the same thing. Yeah, Hoagland will drum for a couple records.
And DiGiorgio's been on a couple records, and then he's been off, playing in the sand or whatever the hell he does.
Yeah, and then there's some guys that were in the lineup, like John Hand,
who never played, never toured,
never played a lick.
No, he just. I guess he took a good picture. So
yeah, but we'll get into all that when we get back up to Scream Bloody Gore. So they went from Mantis with the death by metal thing, and then they kind of, they were frustrated. I think they were living in Orlando at the time, and the Orlando scene was just not happening, and so I think he quit. And then that's when they relocated to Tampa, which is, of course, where the whole Tampa, Morris Sound, big, Florida death metal scene is going to start.
Well, and as big as the scene is looked at, I guess, by outsiders, it was dead there. Yeah. Nobody besides the bands were involved in stuff.
Exactly. Well, this is pre-Executioner. This is pre, Morbid Angel. This is pre all that stuff. And then they reformed, and he took just the simple approach of calling the band Death, just real simple. And he was young at the time. I mean, I want to say he's like 16 or something like that, maybe.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, definitely like 16 or something like that. And in '84, they put out the Reign of Terror demo, which is the first official Death demo. Then you've got a whole bunch of different ones, like the Back from the Dead demo, which he did. Let me back up. Reign of Terror is where he gets Roz and Cam Lee back in the group, and then those guys over there falling out for some odd reason, which we won't get into all the politics here. And then he does the Back from the Dead demo, which he did with the guy Eric Brecht from DRI, and they're trying to be like the fastest band in the world, So and then
they kind of turned in the technicality for a while for speed.
Yeah, and then he kind of was like, well, I can't do any of the ideas I really want to do with that, And so that he kind of quit that. Then he did the Infernal Death demo, which I think he did with some of the Massacre guys again, but don't quote me on that one.
It was
just him and Cam Lee. Okay, that's what it was. And then he sort of decided to quit Death for a while because that wasn't going well. I mean, essentially, this is a frustrating process over from 84, 85 into I think late 85. I think nothing's happening. No one wants the band to play live.
He wants to. I think he really just wants to do something with music, and so he's just trying all these different avenues to see if something clicks or not, and then.
Oh yeah, well, and that's when he quits Death, moves to Canada, and moves to Toronto for a while, tries to join Slaughter, not Mark Slaughter, but the thrash kind of death metal band, and that doesn't go so hot. And then that's right around the time when he tries to hook up with the guys from
Matt Olivio and Scott Carlson from Repulsion Genocide,
But they never record anything
because they can't find a drummer.
And so it all kind of falls apart. And then I think that's when he hooks up with Chris Reefer. They do the Mutilation demo, and that's what finally gets him signed to Combat Records.
Yeah, the funny thing is that between Genocide and Death, those were like two of the biggest underground tape trading. That was almost like a super group.
Sure.
But they just couldn't. Imagine what would have happened.
Exactly. What would that have sounded like? Because those guys are awesome. And so, anyways, it's if you got a flow chart out and you're trying to keep track and connect the dots, good luck to you because it's hard to keep straight. But that all brings us to the song you heard, Infernal Death and the Scream Bloody Gore, which is one of the two records we'll kind of be intimately focused on tonight. This and Leprosy. Scream Bloody Gore was originally recorded in Florida in July of '86, but they had some technical difficulties or something went wrong in the studio, so then they had to move them back out to Hollywood. Actually, to Hollywood with Randy Burns, and they were only in there for a few days, and then they left it all with Randy Burns to mix. And this is a record that needs desperate remastering
if the master tapes exist.
Yeah, which I couldn't tell you. I know the Leprosy songs that we're going to be playing later come from a Century Media
licensed reissue.
Yeah, licensed reissue. So I don't know if they're planning on doing this for Scream Bloody Gore as well. If anybody knows, let us know. Shoot us an email or something. But the record's finally put out in May of '87. So again, when we talk about this record, it's so hard to talk about because really people had heard these songs for years. Like if you were in the metal scene, you were familiar with Mutilation, you were familiar with Infernal Death, with Baptized in Blood, with Evil Dead, things like this.
It's just a matter of hearing it with a little more clarity, I think, now.
And it kind of finally came out, and obviously you can hear all the elements of the kind of the blueprint of death metal, here. I mean, between these guys and Possess, Seven Churches, these were sort of like the two records that I think really laid out what death metal's supposed to sound sound like with the lyrical stuff, the singing style.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think anyone was really singing that kind of like harsh, shriekish tones that Chuck had on that level.
Quorthon was in Bathory, but
that's true.
That's I don't know how prevalent those
I don't know.
were over here.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know how many people were listening to Bathory here and stuff. So, but as you're going to hear in a second when we open up our next kind of big set with Zombie Ritual, Chuck wasn't afraid on this record to also throw in some flares of different unique styles with like the Middle Eastern scales and some of the soloing. You can just definitely sense that Chuck's going to take this beyond just the primitive like stuff that.
Well, he was amping it up even like that's stuff that you didn't even see much in thrash music. I mean, you had the chunk, but this was like taking this other genre that was kind of poo-pooed on by everybody else and like showing like this is where the musicianship's at and this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Now, you wanted to mention, just because of your limited background as a metal drummer. I always like to throw that in, Mark. Just about Reifert, Chris Reifert, who eventually will go on to form Autopsy. His drumming style and how it's different for most death metal.
It's pretty sloppy. You can tell he's got a hard time keeping on. I don't know how if things were played with a click track back then or metronome or what, but he's always just like a half a beat behind all the time, and it always seems to really, I think, shine better when he's given a little bit more breathing room in this, because with Autopsy he's not just doing that plodding drum so much. He actually like opens up his style.
But he gets to slow down in Autopsy, which allows him to do that.
And in Death, he's almost he's acting as a metronome. He's really not doing a whole lot, nothing dynamic to speak of at all. Double bass is almost non-existent.
He doesn't do like blast beats hardly at all.
No, he just seems like he's trying to keep up with Chuck the whole time. Which is probably true.
And it gives it sort of a unique feel, when you compare it to what you're going to hear later with Bill Andrews. It's two kind of different drumming styles.
Yeah, I think Reifert, he's more of a field drummer. I don't think he's not by any stretch of the imagination a technical drummer. No, I'm sure he's all just taught by ear, self-taught kind of thing, and he just plays with feeling. Where I think Chuck's much more. Actually, Chuck skirts the line really nice between a virtuoso and somebody that just plays out of necessity, like like we've talked about, like the Immortal episodes and stuff. Yeah,
it comes back to one of the things about Death is no matter how technical they got, it was always tasteful songwriting.
Yeah, he managed to have it catchy even if it was brutal or if it was ultra technical. So. Yeah,
so pretty cool stuff. So we're gonna hear Zombie Ritual, Mutilation, and then we're gonna close things out with Evil Dead, which has its own sort of unique happenings going on, which we'll kind of talk a little bit about. So, but listen to Mutilation. Mutilation to me sounds a lot like just a Slayer song done death metal style. I mean, it's just like so essential, like Rain and Blood, but like taken to like a little bit further or something. But definitely a crowd favorite here with Zombie Ritual. So enjoy. that was Evil Dead, Mutilation, and Zombie Ritual. And Mark, you were noticing some things about that opening riff in Evil Dead that
reminded me of one of the. I mean, basically on every Dismember album, you've got some kind of like their epic track or whatever, like in Death Sleep or Nina or on Frozen Fields or something as well. Yeah. So we went back and actually listened to a couple of those, and it's just coming from kind of the same direction, I think, basically. But
it does sound so like familiar though, like oh my god, that sounds exactly like something,
we can't I think it's just kind of a death metal trope that people ended up using a lot. But and actually with my limited guitar ability now as well, so I'm a very crappy drummer and guitarist.
Awesome.
That's the kind of like noodling I can actually do.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, and that's the thing about the blueprint that we're talking about here. That's sort of set up with all these different elements. I mean, so many bands sort of stole from this, and you got to put things in perspective. And again, like we said, in 1987, there was hardly anyone in the scene. I mean, really. I mean, there's like, you could probably count them on two hands across the world in terms of relevant.
Well, and they're all
death metal bands,
tape trading with one another. I don't know how many fans outside. I mean, I'm sure there was, but there's probably as many people that were in bands tape trading as just fans.
Sure.
Of the band. So
and Chuck was sort of given, whether or not he wanted or not, I mean, he was given kind of this legendary kind of godfather of death metal status at this point. And it's hard to say like how much that like could have impacted him in terms of like, did it give him too much ego, or things like that?
Yeah.
Or did it put too much pressure on him, so he kind of became like so driven to like push himself to the next level because he felt maybe there were so many expectations being put on him. Well,
I think he wanted to kind of get out of the scene too, but he was always anything like he tried the Control Denied project, which musically is okay, but vocally is just abysmal. But and I think he was always trying to kind of get away from being pigeonholed in that thing. And I think if he could have sang differently, he probably would have.
Oh yeah, and I think that's why. And we won't want to ruin too much of the surprise for when we do this show. But when you get to an album like Sound of Perseverance, I think that's why he was so Jones to do the Judas Priest Painkiller on there. And when I interviewed him,
which is a really killer cover.
Oh man, that's awesome. And when I interviewed him for that record, and he talked a lot about. He goes, man, like when I named the band, like I was like 15. He goes, and what was cooler than death? I mean, it's like it says it all, we're death, and he goes, it sounds good to a 15-year-old. He goes, but now I'm like 30 years old. I'm 32. I'm an intelligent guy. Like, I'm a songwriter, and I'm pigeonholed by my band name in so many ways. And I really do think he never thought of Symbolic and Sound of Perseverance as death metal records. If you were to ask him, he said, no, they're metal records. And he says, that's what I'm playing now. I'm not a death metal guy. I haven't been a death metal guy since like 91, 90.
Yeah, and really like the only thing that really put him in that kind of in that category was vocals. But by that point, I mean, that when was Sound of Perseverance? 97, 98?
98.
I mean, that's probably more of a pure, or at least along the same kind of origins of true death metal than what was happening at the time with all the crossover crap.
Yeah.
So
and so I mean, I think Chuck's roots, and then the influences were in non-death metal bands like Venom, like Slayer, like Celtic Frost. Well, I mean, Celtic Frost, I guess, I guess what I'm getting at is you look at I think I remember reading an article recently when we were researching for the Bathory episode where they said, look, you had Venom and you had Celtic Frost and maybe even had King Diamond and Slayer that had kind of came before Bathory and before Death and even Possessed to some extent, but none of those bands set out to be something unique. They stumbled upon like a sound, like Celtic Frost. They stumbled upon a sound, but just as quickly as they stumbled upon that sound, by the time of Into Pandemonium in 87, they were like out of that sound.
Oh, completely.
And same with, Venom. Venom was just doing shock rock kind of stuff, and Slayer was always
Venom, I don't think I've ever
thrash.
They've been like influential imagery.
And lyrically,
like but musically, they suck, really. There's not anything going on there at all.
Yeah. And Possessed had kind of like, well, I guess 2 albums that were, Seven Churches and was it Beyond the Gates?
Yeah, Beyond the Gates,
which is a record I have, but I'm not that terribly familiar with, so I don't want to speak too much about it. But I really think like Bathory and what Corthon set out to do as like the singular personality of that band is he set hurdles up for himself with every single record to take to take it into the direction he wanted to see it go. And I think Chuck was given that same kind of thing for death metal here on the American shores. And so they became these two sort of central figures who started off being influenced by all the bands that stumbled upon this sound. You know, like, I don't think Tom G. Warrior thought of himself as like the godfather of death metal. I think he just was like, oh, this is something we did for a couple records and it worked, but I'm bored by it. And I'm not really interested.
I don't think the tags weren't around that much back then. It was just like, well, this is just extreme stuff.
Exactly. And whereas, like, to me, I think Chuck was the first guy to embrace death metal as a sound and as a genre and as a movement. And so because he's the first guy to embrace it's very obvious that he'd be one of the first guys by like the early 90s to be exhausted by it and be like, come on guys, can't we get outside the box a little bit more, you know?
Yeah, really.
And you know, the obviously the show we're doing here, only the beginning, the first two records, you're not going to hear that as much. I mean, this is really brutal, blotting, essential death metal, you know? I mean, that's all this is. On the next show that we'll do down the road, like, you'll start to see where there's breathing room for a lot of experimentation and different things that are going to happen. So, but again, going back to, what you said about him being limited by this name and being limited by death metal, I think it's true towards the end. Like, he really was trying to like spread his wings into different areas, and it's like it's the Hendrix question. It's the essential question. What would he, give that guy 20 more years? What would he be doing? Because some bands who get outside of the norm end up being better and doing cooler things. And maybe Control Denied, while being crappy in terms of the vocals, that was like the first step towards like something like down the road that could have worked out for him, I guess. And
really I personally don't see where he would have gone after Sound of Perseverance.
I mean,
you almost have to do
a
completely different kind of approach, because if you just go back and try to backpedal and do something that's more,
let's do new wave death metal again,
either that or new wave of British heavy metal stuff. It's all been done before. Like, why? I think that was kind of his plot in life, was to do that and then leave.
So karmic fate or something like that. But we'll jump back into things here a little bit musically. We got one more song from Scream Bloody Gore, and I just wanted to mention a couple things about the covers here. What's your take on the Death logo and some of these early Death covers and things like that?
I think the Death logo is like the best kitchen sink death metal logo ever. You've got the sickle, you've got a spider web, and a spider, upside down cross, for the T, and you have a Grim Reaper head, and you have the top of the T's on fire.
Sure, and it's all bleeding. And it's all bleeding. And
the funny thing, they kept basically this entire thing all the way to the end. They ended up, drop the spider.
I think they got rid of some of the creatures and things like that inside.
Yeah.
So, I don't have the Sound of Perseverance logo right in front of me, but yeah, a lot of this stuff sort of kept. And if you've seen the Death logo, you know what we're talking about. It's cool stuff. I love the Scream Bloody Gore cover. I actually like it better than the Leprosy one.
I'm a bigger fan of Leprosy cover, I think. The Scream Bloody Gore, it reminds me of...
reminds me of something for like Indiana Jones or something like that.
It reminds me of the Kiss Love Gun cover.
Oh, really?
But remove them and all the girls, and then, you've got a bunch of like skeletons sitting around drinking blood together.
That's true. It seems like something like Temple of Doom or something like that. But
and I think on an LP, when you saw this thing at 12 by 12 inches, it was probably pretty sweet.
Yeah,
but I think as a smaller size, the Leprosy, it's got like a great focal point, and the color choices are really nice.
That's true. Although... tell you the truth, like looking at a rotting skin is, I'd rather look at skulls than rotting skin as a preference, know. But so we got one more coming up from Scream Bloody Gore, and this is another kind of essential one, and it's Baptized in Blood. But I guess just to throw it out there, even though we don't want to really talk much, but how did you get kind of introduced to Death? Where did you first kind of hear them? What era, I guess?
Well, I think me and Chris, when we were doing the magazine, Chris Stick, when we were doing the actual Requiem magazine, I'm sure we heard, I think Chris might even had Leprosy on tape.
Okay.
It didn't really do a whole lot for me at the time, so the first big one for me was Spiritual Healing. And that was actually the first CD I got when I started going away from cassette tapes.
Oh, it was the very first
CD I got was cool. That. So that one was kind of my entry point. And then the first time we saw him was in 93 after Individual Thought Patterns. So.
All right. And see, for me, my entryway was... I don't know if I got Symbolic first or if I got the Death Fate on cassette tape.
Which that was kind of their best of.
Yeah, their best of from the first 3 records, I think.
I think that was
first 4 up to here.
That might have been a like some kind of contract completion thing for Combat.
I think so. And so I was like intimately familiar with like 3 songs from each record. That was it for like many years. And then I think Jeff Grand Corcoon got Spiritual Healing on cassette tape, and we listened to that quite a bit. But I think
crappy cover. A lot of people think. I think it's great. It reminds me of an old thrash cover.
Yeah, it definitely does. Look like an Old Testament cover or something like that, or old.
It reminds me of like Exodus or just some like third tier. Thrash band or something.
Like what's that? Toxic or something like really bad like that, But we'll talk more about Spiritual Healing later. But so that was mine. So like a song like Baptized in Blood, I remember hearing because it was one of the 3 songs from Scream Bloody Gore that was on the Fate tape, So, and then we're gonna bounce into a couple tunes from Leprosy, and we'll talk a little bit more about Leprosy when we come back and about these tunes. But you'll hear Born Dead and Forgotten Past. So enjoy some Baptized in Blood.
Demon time,
That was Forgotten Past, Born Dead, and Baptized in Blood. And we were just making some kind of observations of the last two songs there from Leprosy, which we'll talk about Leprosy in a moment. But Born Dead featured a couple things that in particular form the, kind of fallback of the death sound.
Well, Chuck, I can't name exact instances of the solo, but if you're at all familiar with Death stuff, you'll know that's kind of his signature fallback solo, like as far as like how he's not necessarily the notes, but the arrangement of the notes is how that's like one of the Death solos as far as my ears can tell.
Yeah, it's like in that last minute of Born Dead there, that it's sort of like more melodic than anything else that you've heard to this point.
Yeah, it's not the dive bomb, hammer-on type soloing.
Which you heard a lot in Forgotten Past over and over again. But the other thing that's kind of cool in Born Dead is if you got a keen ear and you're a spiritual healing fan, you definitely heard the same... the
arpeggio of spiritual healing,
yeah. It's pretty cool. Forgotten the Past, very thrashy, which we just heard. It's got that just super catchy, the bridge part, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Been used a million times, yeah.
Like every death metal band's kind of used this stuff. But again, we're talking, this was recorded in April 88 at Morris Sound Studios by Dan Johnson.
The prolific Dan Johnson.
Yeah, the prolific Dan Johnson, who did all those famous Florida death metal records in Morris Sound Studios. Actually, I don't know if he did anything else. I didn't even cross-reference.
He probably did a bunch of heavy metal stuff, I'm sure. Probably rock stuff.
Rock, probably some Laz Rockets CDs or something like that. But Leprosy is a whole nother beast. For me, Mark's favorite of the I guess the first three is Spiritual Healing. For me, it's Leprosy because I think I got this on CD. It was one of the first old Death record I got on CD. I think I got this right at the same time as Human. So I listened to those two quite a bit. And part of the reason is because we had Spiritual Healing on cassette tape. So when we moved to CD, you always looked at the cassette tape and go, well, I got that cassette. I don't need to buy it on CD.
Yeah.
And so I didn't really hear Spiritual Healing for like 10 years after, I didn't really start listening to it again until like 2003, 2004. So it's not a matter of like, I don't like Spiritual Healing.
Well, I don't know if Spiritual Healing is necessarily a better record either. It's just but like I've been living with it for so long.
Yeah. That's your intimate connection, your entryway into death. I think that's why Symbolic will probably always be like one of my favorites too, because it's the first one I ever heard. But the brutality is there. We've got Reifert's left. He's moved on to start up Autopsy, and you've brought in now Terry Butler and Bill Andrews on drums, and you've brought in the other member of Massacre besides Cam Lee, which is Rick Raz on guitar. And I guess after this record, when these guys were on tour for this, like the fights between Raz and Schuldiner just became kind of like epically famous. Like these guys just do not like each other.
Well, I think it was two egos, and there was no middle ground.
Well, it's not, and I think from what I read too is like all the other three guys wanted to advance forward like musically towards Spiritual Healing.
That's right. Yeah, and Raz was just like, no, this is what I want to do, man.
Yeah, I'm cool with this. So no harm done. I mean, I guess it worked out in the end. I mean, James Murphy when he comes in is a much better addition.
Yeah, I would say.
So, but again, you're starting to see these different elements of technicality. They're able to slow the songs down, which we'll hear here in Pull the Plug, which is what we'll open the next set of music up with. They play kind of doomier riffs, I guess, in some parts.
It's not all it's catchier. It's not as plotting and brutal as the previous record.
But Andrews can play some double bass at times.
Yeah, he's kind of a one-trick pony drummer, but he's tight. He doesn't really flourish anything, but I mean, for what they were doing then, I think he was fine.
He's
I think
perfect for the brutality.
On Spiritual Healing, he's a little behind the curve, a little bit compared to everybody else. And the bass in Death has really never been much until like DiGiorgio came in. We didn't know what bass could sound like in Death.
Oh yeah, well, the bass doesn't emerge in Death until Human. Yeah. You hear Human, you hear bass for the first time. So Butler's just sort of like
he's
accentuating the
just filling the wall of noise and stuff.
So, but again, Leprosy is it's a different record, and I think it really stamps kind of a mark, kind of a line in the sand for other bands to like up their A game a little bit. And I would say that guys like Trey from Morbid Angel and some of those guys probably heard this record and said, all right, like, it's time to go. It's time to, like, all right, Chuck's not a one-trick pony. Chuck, is able to write some pretty cool songs here. And the 3 songs we're gonna kind of launch into, we're gonna start with Pull the Plug, and Pull the Plug has always had like that.
It's like their Iron Maiden closer kind of thing.
They the 2 times I saw Death, they closed with Pull the Plug, and
even I was just looking at the old issue of Requiem number 2 from 1993. They ended the show with Pull the Plug.
Pull the Plug. Yeah. So for who knows, I don't know if that goes back to the Leprosy tour that they just started, closing shows with Pull the Plug, but. I can't remember if it mentioned any other songs that they played in that show or not.
I don't think it did.
So, but Pull the Plug is just kind of like essential. And usually when you hear the song live, the crowd is usually singing the chorus and stuff. And these 3 songs, Pull the Plug, Left to Die, and Open Casket. I don't know if you could detect a lyrical theme in those. It's all really about
death.
Dying.
Really, isn't it?
Yeah, really about death. But Left to Die has a really cool breakdown in it, which you'll hear, and then Open Casket has probably the best use of the double bass, just full in your face death metal drumming.
Well, where it's like that's like a mosh pit part, totally.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a rip your head off kind of fight and tear it up and stuff. So it's cool stuff. And what are your thoughts on this? Because this is a record you haven't heard for a long time.
No, stupidly, I used to have the LP of this, and I sold it probably 8 or 9 years ago, and I don't think I've heard it in probably 10. So and going back and listen to it, it definitely it holds up really well, and it's probably the attuned ear that's been listening to stuff for 20 years that picks up on things you didn't when you were a kid. But
exactly,
it's I think there's not really a death record that you shouldn't have in your collection if you're an enthusiast.
No. Even Scream Bloody Gore has its moments, which we heard. Even though there are some songs that are kind of repetitious and kind of unoriginal.
Well, historically, I think it's a necessity. I mean, I went back and got
like Scum.
Yeah, Celtic Frost, Into the Pandemonium. It's not a great record, but all the people that the bands that came out of that influential sound. Yeah, I think it's something you should have in your collection if you're like a metal historian and enthusiast.
And us with our car talk approach to death metal or not death metal, but just all things metal. It's definitely the historical nature of it. So, but this is sort of the powerhouse set. I'd say these are kind of the 3 centerpiece tunes. The hits, if you will. Yes. I think, in fact, all 3 of these songs were the ones on Death Fate, the greatest hits.
Were they? I never had Death Fate. I had a horrible blue cover. Just a picture
it was
of the band
awful looking. But I found it used at the record store for like $2.
We might have sold it back.
Yeah, it was probably yours or Chris's.
Because it had nothing different than if you already had the record.
Exactly. So. But I think it's kind of funny though too the fact that I wonder how much of like Kuhn and I's record collection and tape collection was like a second hand from you and Chris.
I'm sure it was back when we'd get promo tapes and then sell them back once we got the CDs.
Yeah. So we had like the Silk Road of death metal running through Mount Pleasant, essentially. Like trade caravans going on. But anyways, it's cool stuff, and I think you'll enjoy the if you're not driving and you can dance around your room a little bit to Open Casket.
You can mosh on the highway. It's okay.
Yeah, just run into a couple cars. I think you'll want to. So enjoy Pull the Plug, Left to Die, and Open Casket.
Now
to die and pull the plug from the Death Only the Beginning era. So we're going to kind of wind things down here. We've got one more kind of special treat for you, especially if you weren't aware that Leprosy had been remastered.
Oh, remastered in quotes, compared to a lot of people, because it was just, they just upped the sound levels.
But it still sounds pretty good.
Yeah, and it's got a handful of bonus tracks too. So
yeah, the live tracks sound pretty awesome, and we were kind of poking around doing our investigative journalism, and we're no Woodward and Bernstein, that's for sure, because we couldn't find out when these live tracks were from. We assume it's somewhere, obviously, in the 90s, because just the things that Chuck does on this live version of Choke On.
I think it's got to be, from Individual up to, the last record. It sounds more like the Playing There. Mm-hmm. But
the biggest problem is that it's hard to, I don't think it sounded Perseverance, because they weren't playing anything but Pull the Plug live, unless it was some weird, off 3-hour show that Death did a one-time deal. So it had to be, individual or symbolic.
It's full of pinch harmonics, which you didn't really even bring in till
really individual thought patterns, where he kind of really extends himself a lot.
Yeah,
but so
Sound of Perseverance and what Symbolic is where they really started just going crazy with pinch harmonics all the time.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, it was almost like some songs was just like kind of a weaving solo.
Yeah, I mean, he almost did them as much as Isan from Emperor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
except Emperor wrote songs completely based off pinch harmonics, which is kind of funny.
I mean, I guess you could compare the way that I remember seeing Chuck play guitar is the guitar always looked small in his hands, because his hands were just like...
Well, he kept it high, too.
He kept it really high, and he just sort of he owned it. It was weird. He made it look like a toy, the way he handled a guitar.
I've noticed a lot of technical players usually keep them kind of high and tight to the chest.
Oh, do they?
I noticed, what is it, Paul from...
Paul Masvidal?
Yeah, he kept it like that as well, like guys from Dillinger. Keep them nice and tight up against their chest, so...
That makes sense. You have more,
probably got more
finger
control.
dexterity and stuff like that.
With Slayer and stuff, nothing's too crazy, so, Carrie's just, as long as it's big old, hunk of meat there will keep moving.
Yeah, exactly.
Keep doing it. So,
and but then you've got, and this is a little ode back to Chris's comment about my love of George Lynch. See, Lynch could do it, but he could also do the spin,
the swing around.
So he could swing that sucker around and still keep his solos going. So there's different levels of guitar heroism, I guess, that exist in the hierarchy.
Dokken never really went for all out balls out speed.
No. Kiss of Death is about as fast as they ever got. But anyways, we don't want to annoy with we're talking Death here, and
if you want Dokken, go back and listen to a couple episodes ago.
There you go. We got a little tasty treat for you. We've got some Choke On It live that we're gonna end things with, and this is really, all the live songs are pretty good. The recordings are great. One of the things that you always sort of run into, of course, is it's live, but do I want to listen to it? And these are songs.
That's the problem with. That's another thing that kind of makes me think it's in the '90s, because I haven't heard a lot of good death metal live records until the '90s, when people actually understood how to record the stuff.
Yeah, and were playing. They were able to sort of, slow the notes down in some ways, or at least give some breath, so that there's
more definition to everything. Mm-hmm. It's not just like a blur of we'd go see Carcass and it just basically every once in a while you'd hear the drums. So,
which incidentally, you and I are gonna be going to see Carcass a week from now. Pretty much a week from Monday,
March 16th.
Yeah,
I'm stoked. It's been since 94, or the last time I saw him was on the Heartwork tour.
It's been never for me.
Yeah, that's cool. So At the Gates in Carcass within a year. That's not bad.
This is the flip flop. Mark never had seen At the Gates, and he got to see him this summer, and I'd never seen Carcass. So, anyways, we're kind of wrapping things up here. Let us know what you thought. Obviously, we're not ignoring the other Death records. They're coming down the pipe.
Yeah, we just thought that. This is a band that we're so invested in the scene. It owes a lot to them as well. Why not kind of go through their entire discography and give them a little bit extra time, because I think it's well warranted.
And we're never going to get anything more from Death. And that's that's a sort of sad statement, kind of like doing the Bathory show last week. It's just there's a finality to this band,
unless they do what like Sun Ra Orchestra did, where all the orchestra members get back together and do the Death thing. But I don't know who would fill Chuck shoes as far as, I mean, somebody could play the guitar, but nobody's got his presence or his vocals.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Like every
the Chuck Schuldiner Orchestra.
Every ex-member of Death come. I mean, because you got Andy LaRocque from King Diamond. You've got
it's huge.
You've got Gene. I mean, you could have like 7 drummers just like lining the stage. It could be just like a drum fest. It'd make Fantomas and
so the Schuldiner estate. Maybe look into that. That'd be. I think that could be all right.
I think that'd be cool. But there'd be a lot of people probably don't like each other up on stage. Hey, you replaced me. No, you replaced me.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's Carlson doing these days? Huh?
He's touring with Repulsion.
That's right.
And he's playing with Exhumed, I think, too.
Yeah. What's Reefer? Is Reefer doing anything? Is he doing Abscess still?
I thought he was in some other.
Oh wait, was he in Murder Squad? Was he?
I don't think so. No, that was all Swedish guys.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I thought
he's been in a bunch of random stuff.
Anyway, so you'd have to dig some of these guys out of the woodwork a little bit, but it could be pretty interesting. So, but we're gonna kind of put a close on the great early brutal death metal era of Death before we kind of get into more of the technical origins, technicality of human and spiritual healing and stuff. So, it's been fun, and please shoot us an email with some of your comments at requiempodcast@gmail.com.
Also, check out requiempodcast.com, the new destination site on the web for all things Requiem Podcast related.
Yeah, let us know what you want. Let us know, thoughts.
Give us feedback. We've also got, if you'd like to help us out at all with our costs that are inferred by doing the show, there's going to be a donate button where you can donate, whatever you feel is appropriate.
50 cents.
I'd prefer at least a dollar. But think of it like
that 50 cents adds up.
I know. Think of it like National Public Radio. They need money to keep bringing you this great free programming.
You got to buy more records so we can do the background checks on them.
Exactly. Also, you got
our
playlists on the side as well. If you click through that, helps us out as well. So any little bit that can help us keep doing these shows would be fantastic. Yeah. Besides just your feedback is fantastic.
It's invaluable, really, because I think one of the comments we recently heard was something about wanting to hear a little bit more from us and less
more music, less music, which was kind of nice. Yeah, nice to hear in a way. It makes a little bit more work for us, but I think it's probably a more satisfying show and more listenable, and with repeat listens or something.
As long as we have enough to say about some of the bands.
Yeah,
some bands don't. There's not a whole lot of mystery to them. They're just kind of are what they are. But Death, there's a lot of storytelling there. So,
and give us iTunes reviews or give us a plug on your blog. Anything like that would be fantastic. So,
yeah. But anyways, so it's been fun. So enjoy some Choke on It live. So for Requiem Metal Podcast, I'm Jason,
and I'm Mark, and don't choke on it.
So it's called Choke on It.